Hey guys, tonight we're going to wander into a very peculiar corner of history, the strange, sometimes absurd, and often terrifying world of ancient punishments. From the little girls of Rome forced into lives of purity as Vestal Virgins, to crucifixions turned into public theatre, to bizarre tools dug out of the ruins of Pompeii, and finally to the haunting fear of being erased from memory itself. This is not the story of glorious victories or shining empires. It is the slow, heavy story of whips, branding irons, missing faces on statues, and the echo of chains that somehow survived for 2,000 years. It may sound dark, but told in this sleepy way, it is boring history for sleep, a calm voice from the sleepy historian on Historian Sleepy 365, here to help you drift away while still learning something forgotten. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Historian Sleepy 365 so you'll never miss another quiet journey through the past. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Dim the lights, slow your breathing, and let's step gently into the world of punishments, stranger than you think. Imagine being just a little girl, 6, maybe 7, 10 at most. You haven't grown old enough to tie your own hair properly, still not tired of rag dolls or the clacking of pebble games out in the yard. Your mornings smell like kitchen smoke in a small home, filled with your mother's cheerful shouting from the stove, and sometimes the rhythmic sound of your father's sandals tapping the brick floor after a long day's work. It's a safe world, a small one, warm with the breath of family. And then one day, there's a knock at the door. But it's not the usual kind. Not a neighbor asking to borrow salt. Not a fish seller passing by. Standing at your doorstep are men in white togas, and beside them a priest, stern-faced, unsmiling. They're not here to ask for anything. They're here to choose, and by choose they mean take. To the Romans, selecting a Vestal Virgin was just as serious as appointing a general. Her job, keep the sacred fire of Vesta burning always, because if it ever went out, they believed Rome itself would begin to crumble. The requirements sound simple enough. A girl between 6 and 10, healthy, no physical defects, born to free Roman citizens. But really what it meant was a death sentence for childhood. Picture the whole family frozen in the yard, the mother clinging to her daughter's shoulders, hands trembling, the father trying to smile, but his eyes betray him, because everyone knows to resist is to insult the gods. And in Rome, turning your back on the gods was like turning your back on reality itself. So the little girl, still dusty from a morning spent playing in the street, is led away. The harshest part wasn't even the strict rules waiting ahead. It was the separation. Becoming a Vestal meant being cut off from your family. No more parents to protect you. No more siblings to play with. Even your name slowly fades. You become a daughter of Vesta. You belong to the temple now and no longer to yourself. Imagine this. One night you're still curled up on your straw bed in a room you know by heart. The next morning you're walking through the gates of the temple, leaving everything behind. From now on, no one will call you by your sweet little nickname. All that remains is a title, dry, cold, and sacred. Training starts immediately. Older Vestals, already skilled in the art of blank expressions and slow, deliberate movements, become your instructors, not in reading, not in writing, but in how to stand perfectly straight, how to lower your eyes just right, how to pour ritual water without spilling a drop. You memorize long Latin prayers you barely understand. Even sleep isn't guaranteed, because that fire, Rome's sacred flame, must never go out. And sometimes that means a 7-year-old child jolting awake in the middle of the night, dragging logs with sleepy hands, eyes still sticky with dreams. In a normal childhood, you trip, you cry, you laugh again. As a Vestal, childhood becomes ceremony. Every step, every breath, monitored. Of course there were honors too. You wore pure white robes, you got the best seat at festivals, people bowed in respect. But let's be real, that honor was just a gold collar on a bird. Shiny, yes. Beautiful, sure. Still a chain, because deep down they were still just kids. Kids who missed playing catch, missed gossiping with friends, missed laughing too loud without someone whispering, unbecoming. Picture the temple at night. Cold marble, flickering flame, the pop of burning sap, wind weaving through stone halls. And a little girl sits alone, hands clasped, eyes lowered. Outside, Rome bustles, merchants, drinkers, shouting in the streets. Inside, only silence, heavy, pressed down like stone. And that child? She's probably remembering the smell of her mother's porridge, the giggle of her baby brother, the messy little home that somehow always felt warm. Now all she has is incense, chants, and the crushing responsibility of keeping Rome safe. Romans loved to say that being a Vestal was the highest honor for a woman. Sounds impressive, but really, it was like handing a kid the keys to a nuclear reactor and saying, "Congrats, sweetie." One wrong move and we all die. One word from her could free a prisoner. One mistake could get her buried alive. Sounds familiar? Like giving you the key to the cookie jar, then warning that if you eat even one, you'll be thrown into a pit. Even as little girls, Vestals already whispered stories of those who came before, those who failed, the beatings, the starvation, the burials. They didn't understand all the politics, but they felt the fear. The temple might be grand, but inside was thick with shadows. Like being invited to a palace, only to realize every door locked from the outside. In Rome, childhood didn't always end with a birthday. Sometimes it ended with a knock from the gods, or more accurately, from some very serious-looking priests. Somewhere, back in the family home, a rag doll lies forgotten. And its little owner now wears a robe too big for her and steps into a role she doesn't even understand. They told her she was chosen, but maybe deep down she sometimes wondered, am I truly special or just convenient for Rome? On her first morning, inside the Temple of Vesta, the little girl was no longer anyone's daughter. She had officially become a cog in the ceremonial machine Rome liked to call its spiritual backbone. Gone were the cozy wake-up calls of warm porridge and a mother's voice. In their place, the heavy footsteps of the elder priestess pacing the marble halls, the soft crackle of sacred fire licking at the logs. But let's not romanticize it. That flame? It wasn't just fire. Romans believed it was the beating heart of the empire. And if it ever went out, the whole thing could come crashing down. Sounds noble, right? Sure. But for an 8-year-old with shaky hands and no bedtime, the reality was simpler. If the fire dies, you either get beaten to a pulp or buried alive. Kind of a lot for a night shift. The day began with a bath in natron, a chalky salt the Egyptians once used for embalming mummies. But for a Vestal, natron wasn't for preserving the dead, it was for preserving purity. Imagine rubbing your tiny soft arms with what feels like gritty baking soda mixed with existential dread. It stings, it dries your skin, your fingers shrivel like overcooked raisins. But Rome liked that gentle sting. They believed cleanliness wasn't just physical, it had to reach the soul. And the fastest way to cleanse your soul was apparently to make your skin feel like it was being peeled off. After that, oils. Almond oil, olive oil, maybe some fancy-smelling resin. Not to moisturize the poor girl's skin, mind you, but to make sure her scent wouldn't offend the gods. A sort of divine deodorant. Except instead of a dab under the arms, you turned your entire body into a walking incense stick. Then came the fire. It sat in the center of the temple, a deep stone pit glowing red at all hours. First duty of the day, keep it alive. The firewood had to be chosen carefully, placed gently with both hands. No "oops, I'll fix it later" allowed. If the flames even thought about dying down, even if your legs were tired or your mind wandered for a second, Rome would not send thoughts and prayers. Number. There are records of Vestals being stripped, beaten, and publicly shamed if the fire so much as flickered out. And remember, we're still talking about a child. Rome was known for creative punishments, but with Vestals, mental torture was often more artistic than physical. The hours after that, chanting. Soft little voices repeating long, complicated Latin prayers, over and over. It didn't matter that they didn't understand half of it. What mattered was that the words kept flowing, like white noise for the gods, because, heaven forbid, the gods get bored. Ironically, the one most at risk of dozing off was the girl. Imagine this. You woke up at 3 a.m. to throw logs into a sacred fire. Now it's mid-morning. You're standing for hours whispering lines you barely remember, all while fragrant smoke from sacred resin curls into your eyes, burning lungs, and a brain slowly turning into mashed figs. It's a miracle they didn't start sleepwalking into the flame, but it didn't end there. Every movement was monitored. Look the wrong way, smile at a passing dog, giggle during prayers, expect a stern correction. Vestal behavior had to match Rome's ideal: solemn, spotless, emotionless. But kids are kids. Of course she got scolded for laughing at the wrong time. Of course she wrinkled her nose when her hair smelled like smoke and sanctity. Still, amid all this rigidity, there was plenty of glam. Vestal Virgins wore long white robes with crimson ribbons, their heads covered in pristine veils. They got front row seats at public games, fancy chariots to ride in, and people bowed when they passed, as if the divine spirit of Rome itself was out for a stroll. But inside that ceremonial outfit, the feet were still going numb from too much standing, the back still ached from too much kneeling. And the little girl inside, still tired, still human, the whole day went like that: salt scrubs, fire tending, chanting, ritual practice, repeat. Childhood didn't fade, it got overwritten, replaced by a color-coded, incense-scented calendar. A normal little girl might fall asleep to her mother's lullaby. But a Vestal? She fell asleep to the sound of burning wood, and every time the fire crackled unpredictably, so did her heartbeat, because she knew it wasn't just her fate that hung in the balance, it was Rome's. And nighttime brought no relief. When the city finally quieted down, when normal families climbed into beds of straw, Vestal girls still took turns watching the fire. In the cold darkness of the marble temple, the glow of the flame lit up her young face, casting shadows that made her look older than she was. Each night, the same. Each night, again. She became a living clock. Rome had figured out how to turn little girls into timekeeping machines. And in that repetition, a quiet fear crept in. Not fear of gods, but fear of people. Fear of what those hands might do if she ever slipped. Somewhere in the corners of her mind, maybe she dreamed of running, let the fire go out, let it all go, but dreams like that stayed locked in her head, because Rome doesn't sleep, and neither does the flame. If you were a Vestal, your childhood was officially over, replaced by a never-ending shift, a shift for the gods, a shift for the city, a shift for laws stricter than fire itself. If you're thinking being a Vestal was all pain and punishment, well, Rome knew how to sprinkle sugar on even the bitterest pill. Sure, they made little girls stand for hours by a fire and exfoliate with corpse salt, but they also gave them perks powerful men would envy. To ordinary Roman citizens, seeing a Vestal walking down the street was like watching a tiny saint glide by in a white robe. People stepped aside. They bowed their heads. Some even whispered that it was a sign of good luck. For a girl who'd spent her early years running barefoot in the dust, being treated like that was probably a bit overwhelming. At grand festivals in the arena where tens of thousands packed in to watch gladiators slice each other into human charcuterie, Vestal Virgins didn't have to jostle for seats or shout, "Save me a spot." They sat in places of honor, front row, right where the emperor and top officials planted their well-fed behinds. In that sunlit spotlight wrapped in white, they weren't just spectators. They were part of the show. A living reminder that the gods were also watching. Picture the irony. A stadium drenched in blood, cheers and screams echoing, metal clashing against metal. And in the VIP row, a handful of teenage girls pretending to look unbothered, as if watching someone get decapitated was just a tasteful afternoon activity. Outside the arena they travelled in style too, chariots complete with escorts. In Rome, most women were expected to sit quietly in the back, wedged between family members, largely invisible. Not the Vestals. They sat tall, veiled, with every eye on them. People lining the roads watched in awe and just a little fear. Because this wasn't just ceremony. It was power. With a single phrase, a Vestal could pardon a condemned prisoner. "I forgive him," said by a 16-year-old in white, could override an entire courtroom. If you've ever been made class monitor and felt the rush of writing someone's name down for talking, multiply that by 100. That was Vestal-level power, but, and there's always a but, every privilege came with an invisible leash. Sure, you got the nice seat, but also constant reminders. Too loud, disrespectful. Sit crooked, disrespectful. Stare too long at a gladiator, deeply disrespectful. So from her prestigious perch, the little Vestal became a living statue, studied by tens of thousands of eyes, no room to yawn, no space for a wandering gaze. That privilege? Just a golden cage. Same with the chariot. From the outside it looked grand. From the inside it was surveillance on wheels. The Vestal wasn't joyriding through town. She was a walking billboard. Rome sees you. Rome knows where you are. An ancient GPS, but instead of satellites, you had the judgmental stares of half the city. Even the famous power to pardon wasn't safe. If she spared the wrong criminal, whispers would spread, "She's been bribed." If she spared no one, people would say, "She's heartless." Power, sure, but never peace. Here's the real kicker. Vestal Virgins were among the only women in Rome allowed to own property, sign contracts, and act independently, without needing a man's permission. While most wives had to ask their husbands to breathe, a Vestal could pick up a stylus and sign her own name. Sounds like feminism 1,000 years ahead of schedule. Except, to get that pen, she had to trade away 30 years of her life. 30 years inside a system with no love, no family, no room for mistakes. Call it empowerment if you want, but it smelled a lot like a contract with the devil. Here's a theory. Rome was a genius manipulator. They understood that humans need motivation to endure hard things. So they gave the Vestals just enough perks, enough admiration, enough glamour to keep outsiders jealous and insiders just barely proud. But under every benefit, another rope wrapped tighter. A throne where you couldn't shift your weight. A chariot with no say in the destination. A signature with no chance at a future partner. The power to spare a life, while your own hung by a thread named chastity. A child raised in that world would learn to smile in silence, to accept stares without reacting. Survival skill. but also erosion. Each day added one more invisible chain. Until one day she looked at her privileges and realized this wasn't joy, it was branding, shiny, polished labels to hide the fact that she was still a prisoner. Rome knew that. Rome didn't care, because to Rome, a Vestal didn't need to be happy. She just needed to exist as a symbol. So the seats of honor, the chariots, the legal power, they all became parts of the same necklace, expensive, dazzling, and tightening. To outsiders, it looked like glory. To her, it looked like a childhood slowly being converted into ritual. And somewhere beneath the cheers of the crowd, beneath the horse hooves and the scratching stylus, a quiet question might echo in her mind. If this is freedom, then what exactly is prison? Perhaps the most terrifying part of being a Vestal wasn't the endless prayers. It wasn't the sleepless nights guarding a sacred flame. It was the invisible blade hanging silently overhead, the vow. 30 years in service to the gods. 30 years without love, without marriage, without even the faintest trace of intimacy with a man. On paper, it sounds like a life of purity. But let's not forget we're talking about real human beings, with real hearts and real longings. Rome wanted them to be marble, but beneath the white robes was still the heartbeat of a girl. And hearts, well, they tend to wander. So yes, in Rome's long history, some Vestals were accused of breaking their vow. Maybe it was a secret romance whispered in the dark. Maybe just a glance held a beat too long. Or maybe, let's be honest, Rome needed a scapegoat. Whatever the reason, the consequences were never light. The man involved, usually beaten to death right in the marketplace, public, brutal, crowd-pleasing, a cruel little performance, Rome's way of saying, this is what happens when you touch the divine. And the Vestal? Rome got creative. They didn't spill her blood. That would be sacrilegious. Her blood was holy. So instead, they buried her alive. Sounds merciful, right? No knives, no whips. But it was one of the most horrific punishments ever devised. Imagine it. A young woman led through the streets, flanked by guards, surrounded by silence. No one dares speak. No one dares touch. All they do is watch. Her once symbolic white robe, now a funeral shroud. She's taken to a small underground chamber, already dug out. Inside, a little food, a flickering oil lamp, a jug of water, just enough for Rome to say, we didn't kill her. We just gave her space to meet her end. A tidy lie. Everyone knew she wouldn't last long. And the last sound she heard, not prayers, not forgiveness, shovels, the scrape of dirt, the thud of weight, the light above her shrinking, then vanishing. The air thickens, a shallow breath, then another, then sweat, panic, and a chest that feels like it's being wrapped in rope. She tries to claw at the walls, but they're just dirt. No one to hear her, no reason to scream, just her breath racing, her heartbeat pounding like it's trying to escape. And the dirt keeps falling, steady, rhythmic, like a lullaby made of soil. Rome called it preserving the city's purity. But if you look closely, it was execution, disguised in ceremony. The people, they sighed in relief. The gods, they believed, were pleased. Rome had cleansed itself. But what about the girl? For her, death didn't come from the gods. It came from human hands, from cruelty dressed in ritual. And the bitterest part? All those privileges, the seats of honor, the chariots, the legal power, gone. All of it. All it took was an accusation. One night, she's a sacred figure. The next, a nameless body in a pit of dirt. Rome was a master of the pedestal and the fall. They could raise someone to divinity, drop them like a stone. And if you listen closely, you might imagine the last sound in that silent grave wasn't the earth closing in, but a whisper, a question no one answered. I gave my life to Rome. Why did Rome choose to end it like this? The Romans probably liked to think they'd invented something truly unique with the Vestal Virgins, turning childhood into ritual, turning human beings into living flames. But zoom out a bit, and you'll notice a sad pattern in human history. Our fondness for turning certain people, usually women, into symbols of purity just so the rest of society can feel like it's doing the right thing. Take ancient Egypt, for example. In Memphis or Thebes, priestesses served in the temples of Hathor or Isis. No, they weren't buried alive if they messed up, but they lived under strict discipline. Records say they had to keep their bodies flawless, bathe in lotus-scented water, eat modestly, and spend entire days singing hymns to the gods. It sounds gentler than being a Vestal. But the result was the same. Their youth dissolved into ritual. Everyday laughter replaced with steady temple chants. If Vestals lived in fear of the grave, Egyptian priestesses lived in fear of impurity, of being cast out, erased. One punishment ended in a pit, the other in oblivion. Either way, society made sure to punish any woman who strayed from her role as a living goddess. In imperial China, there were the palace maids, young girls drafted into the forbidden city. They didn't tend sacred fires, they tended the appearance of royal order. Most never chose this life. They lived in the shadows, under the eyes of eunuchs and court officials. Rewards were rare, punishments frequent. One rumor, just a whisper, could make a palace maid vanish without trace. Not physically dead, but forgotten. No name, no story, no memory. A kind of Eastern damnatio memoriae. In Japan, geisha are often painted in soft strokes, elegant, refined, cultural treasures. But behind the white makeup and crimson lips was a life boxed in by expectations. They didn't serve gods, they served art, and purity of form in their role. Everything. The pluck of a shamisen string, the tilt of a sake bottle, the placement of a step, was ritual. Did they have freedom? Maybe less than we think. Like the Vestals, they stopped being themselves and became what society needed them to be. And the price of becoming that image? Giving up the most ordinary, most human things. Loving freely. Laughing loudly. Rome didn't bother hiding its cruelty. They made Vestal punishments public. They wanted you to see it. And maybe that's what makes the tombstone of Cornelia, one of the most famous Vestals, feel so powerful. She was accused of breaking her vow. According to Pliny and other sources, as she was led to be buried alive, she cried out, "If I am innocent, then this punishment will destroy Rome." They say her eyes remained calm, even as the earth began to cover her, as if she was planting guilt into the conscience of the city. Rome, of course, never admitted wrongdoing. But her gravestone still stands, a relic of the fact that even in sacrifice, a person can try to hold on to their dignity. Pliny wrote about the Vestals, sometimes in awe, sometimes in something closer to fear. He called them living statues of purity. But think about that for a second. When someone is called a living statue, are they still considered fully human? That's the tragedy. Society applauds sacrifice, but it's that same sacrifice that strips a person of their humanity. And here's what cuts across all cultures. Rome, Egypt, China, Japan, different languages, different gods, different empires, but one shared anxiety, the fear of chaos. And to keep chaos at bay, society builds symbols, icons of purity, priestesses, palace maids, geisha, Vestal Virgins. And once the icon is built, they trap the person inside. As long as the symbol holds, everyone feels safe. But if it cracks, if she slips, then fear mutates into rage, and that rage is always communal. It becomes public punishment. What chills us isn't the differences between civilizations, it's the sameness. Purity has never come cheap. It's bought with childhoods, with laughter, with love, and sometimes with life itself. And somehow, across time and continent, humanity keeps signing the same unfair contract. One woman pays the price, so everyone else can feel protected and divinely approved. In the sound of shovels covering a fallen vestal, in the whispers about a vanished palace maid, in the lonely echo of a geisha's shamisen performance at a party where no one really loves her, you can hear the same fear. The fear that once you become a symbol, your mistakes are no longer your own. They become collective disappointment, and your punishment becomes a performance. And the crowd, those who applauded, those who prayed, those who smiled and toasted, becomes the one burying the icon they once adored. That is the real cost of purity. A cost no one volunteers to pay, but many are forced to carry for the comfort of the whole. And when night falls, you can almost imagine them, the vestals, the priestesses, the palace maids, the geisha, sitting alone in silence, staring at a flame, or a wall, or a polished bronze mirror, and asking themselves, was I ever truly me, or just the shadow they needed me to be? And so we close the door on the stone halls of the Temple of Vesta, a place where little girls were turned into living flames, praised for their purity, but made to pay for it with their childhoods and sometimes their lives. But Rome didn't reserve its trials only for children in white robes. Beyond the temple, out on the cobbled streets and crowded forums, there were others, people who also became symbols. But this time they weren't symbols of virtue. They were made to represent sin, treason, philosophy. They weren't buried in silence. They were dragged into the light before roaring crowds, so that their deaths could be turned into lessons. If the Vestals were punished in private, these figures were punished on stage. And that is exactly where we're headed next. Into the faces of punishment, where death was both sentence and spectacle. A final performance for the entire empire. In our imagination, the word crucifixion needs no introduction. A wooden cross, massive nails, a body suspended between sky and earth, and a crowd below, watching, whispering, performing a moral sort of horror. But to Rome, crucifixion wasn't just a method of execution, it was public theatre, and there was never a shortage of audience. The Roman Empire was proud of many things: straight roads, underground plumbing, a legal system that still leaves traces in our modern laws. But if you asked whether they were also proud of turning human agony into public programming, the answer would probably still be yes. Romans were practical, and they understood something chillingly well. Fear doesn't just grow in the dark. Sometimes it needs to be spotlighted, like a billboard. A crucifixion began uneventfully. The condemned was usually a slave, a rebel, or anyone the state felt deserved to be made an example of. They were dragged through the streets, not to save on transport, but so the entire city could see. This is the face of someone who stood against the empire. It was like an ancient form of outdoor advertising, except instead of a promo banner, you had a bloodied, broken body stumbling beneath the weight of a wooden crossbeam. And the execution site, always outside the city, always somewhere busy. No privacy. Just a constant crowd. It was the ancient version of going live. No signal, no TikTok, just a well-placed hill on the way to the market. Instant viewership. And let's be clear, crucifixion wasn't designed to kill quickly. It was engineered for duration. First, came the nails, or in some cases ropes, driven into wrists and ankles. The nails were thick enough to bite into bone, making every twitch speed up the bleeding. But they were careful not to strike anything too vital. The goal wasn't mercy, it was memory. Fast deaths don't leave lasting impressions. The pain wasn't just from the nails. Once hoisted up, the entire body sagged. All your weight pressed down on your shoulders and chest. Breathing became labor. To take a deep breath, you had to pull yourself up, with the same hands that had been nailed in place. Every breath became a torture cycle. Death came slowly, by suffocation, by exhaustion, or by a heart that simply gave up. Victims could hang there for hours, or days. Yes, days. You could go watch in the morning, run errands, come back in the evening, and the show was still going. It had everything: grief, gore, and, somehow, a festival vibe. Vendors worked the crowd, selling bread, watered wine, roasted snacks. Children peeked through legs. Adults pointed and debated. Sometimes, someone even showed up with a lyre singing mock songs about the condemned. A full sensory event. If we go to soccer games to feel something, ancient Rome had crucifixions. Roman historians say it was most commonly used to control slaves. After the Spartacus rebellion, thousands of crucifixions lined the Appian Way, the empire's main artery into the city. Every few dozen meters, a body. A long, bloody ad campaign spanning miles with one simple message: don't. And don't think this was only for nameless nobodies. Sometimes crucifixion was used for special guests. Take the death of Jesus. It wasn't just an execution, it was a statement. Rome wanted to make it clear, even so-called messiahs end up on crosses. Even the anointed bleed. What makes crucifixion especially chilling isn't just the death, it's the humiliation. While the wealthy got to die quietly, poison, warm baths, poetic exits, slaves and traitors were stripped naked and nailed up for the world to see. The death of the voiceless. If a Vestal Virgin was buried alive in the silence of ritual, then crucifixion was the opposite. You were buried in light, under the sun, under the stairs. So crucifixion wasn't just punishment, it was propaganda, a cultural ritual, and a nightmare served raw. Because maybe the worst part wasn't the pain, though it was unbearable, it was the isolation. You were hung up in plain sight, close enough for everyone to see your sweat, your blood, but not close enough for anyone to care. You were alone, but on display. A floating existence, abandoned between life and death. They say Roman law was written in stone. But sometimes its messages were written in human bodies, stretched out, nailed up for all to read. And if you think that's tragic, and also kind of grotesque, you're absolutely right. Rome liked its justice slow, public, and unforgettable. This is how they kept the empire wide awake, not with speeches, not with scrolls, but with slow deaths, staged like open-air theatre. No one dared skip. Among the countless tales spun around crucifixion, there's one that's echoed through centuries, not just in churches, but in paintings, history books, and movies. The death of Saint Peter, yes, Peter, one of the 12 apostles of Jesus, the guy who, depending on the day, was either bravely devout or spectacularly clumsy. What made his crucifixion legendary wasn't the fact that it happened. It was how he asked for it to happen. Strange, right? But as we've learned, to the Romans, strange was just seasoning for public execution. According to tradition, Peter was arrested under Emperor Nero, a man best remembered for fiddling while Rome burned and allegedly turning people into backyard tiki torches. Peter's crime? Preaching about Jesus? And Nero wasn't a fan of any sermon that distracted people from, well, Nero. So Peter was sentenced to die. Crucifixion, of course, business as usual. Until Peter spoke up. I'm not worthy to die the same way my teacher did. Please, crucify me upside down. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, wait, he chose the deluxe edition of one of the worst deaths imaginable. Yes, he did. But in the odd, overlapping logic of faith and empire, this was an act of humility. To Peter, dying like Jesus was too much honor. So he asked for something less. And the Romans probably raised an eyebrow, shrugged and said, "All right then." Bonus round it is Romans were efficient and darkly theatrical. If a condemned man wanted to turn his death into a statement, they were more than happy to turn it into a scene. And so Peter was crucified upside down, one of the strangest crucifixions in history, and one of the most haunting. Physically, regular crucifixion was already unbearable. Upside down, worse. Blood rushed to the head, vision blurred, veins swelled, breathing, already torture, became near impossible. Your brain spun, your heart panicked. Some modern doctors think this version of death might come faster, but we're still talking hours, not minutes. Peter, even in his humble version of martyrdom, still endured the full burn of public agony. Ironically, to the Romans, an upside-down cross meant nothing, just another way to hang a body, maybe a bit of flair. But to future Christians, it became a sacred image, the final act of the man who would be called the first pope, a humiliating death turned holy, a public punishment turned into legacy. Rome, as always, didn't see it coming. Picture the scene: a crowd gathers, some bored, some curious. To most, it's just another side event, today's matinee horror show, but hidden among them, a few followers, watching not just a man suffer, but a faith take root. A paradox unfolds. The empire flexes its muscle through nails and rope. The believer flexes his faith through voluntary suffering. Out of that moment came a strange symbol, the upside-down cross. At first, it meant Peter, humility, sacrifice, faith. But as time does, it twisted the meaning. Centuries later, the upside-down cross became edgy, used by heretical groups, by rebels, by heavy metal bands, by horror movies. From humility to "I'm not like other boys." Peter, or wherever his bones are, is probably side-eyeing the whole thing, watching guitarists shred beneath the very symbol he once considered sacred. But that's how symbols work. To the Romans, crucifixion was a stage to terrify. To Peter, it was a stage to testify. To later generations, it became a story, retold, reframed, reinterpreted. Once a symbol leaves its original moment, it picks up new meanings: devotion, rebellion, humility, protest. So the next time someone flashes an upside-down cross and declares, "I'm fighting the system," remember, that symbol was first used by a man who said, "I'm too small to die like my savior." History has a sense of irony like that. And Rome, for all its planning, precision, and polished cruelty, never could have predicted that one of its executions, intended to break a man, would instead inspire billions. After the final shouts of Spartacus's slave army faded, Rome did not only breathe a sigh of relief for quelling the largest uprising in its history, it also faced a bitter truth. The very soldiers called the backbone of the empire had once trembled, broken ranks, and let the enemy turn them into a spectacle in the middle of the battlefield. For the Romans, defeat was never just the loss of land or lives, it was the loss of face. And when honor was stripped away, Rome rarely chose subtle solutions. It chose what was blunt, merciless, and intensely theatrical. That was the moment when a punishment called decimatio, decimation, stepped onto the stage. The name sounds like some dull exercise in arithmetic, but in reality, it was an ancient version of a survival game. 1 falls, 9 remain. Picture it, the whole unit lined up, tense as students awaiting exam results. Except here, grades did not matter. What mattered was who drew the short stick. 1 out of 10 would win the jackpot, to be beaten to death by the other 9. Brutal, yes, but Rome called it discipline. Cassius, one of the 3 men allied with Caesar and Pompey, wealthy enough to boast that he could feed an entire army from his own fortune, was the one who ordered decimation after the Spartacus revolt. To him, this was not merely punishment, it was a ritual of purification, a reminder that fear was not out there in Spartacus. Fear lived here, inside their own ranks. You fear the enemy? Wrong. You should fear the cold eyes of your comrades, holding stones and clubs, waiting for their turn to bring them down on your head. Imagine the scene, 10 soldiers grouped together, all trembling, not knowing which of them would fall into the cursed number. Then the lot is drawn, a stick, a token, or simply the officer's word. The unlucky one is pulled out, his limbs held fast. And then the 9 who once shared bread, who once laughed by the fire, must turn executioners. None can refuse because refusal means joining the victim. So the blows rain down, stone, wood, fists, until a fellow becomes a corpse. You might think this is the fastest way to destroy comradeship. But the Romans thought the opposite. To them, this collective horror was the cement of unity. After killing a brother with your own hands, you no longer dared to betray. Because everyone understood, betrayal meant not just the enemy's blade, but your own friend's hand as executioner. That was a wound deeper than any sword. Curiously, Rome did not practice decimation often. It was rare, but when it happened, no one ever forgot. A unit that survived decimation carried a permanent brand of shame. They were forced to live on reduced rations. Wheat exchanged for barley, the cheap grain of slaves. They had to sleep outside the camp, barred from safety. In other words, decimation did not only kill one man, it turned the 9 survivors into walking ghosts, burdened with guilt, disgrace, and a blood-forged bond. Cassius surely knew this. He did not need every soldier to be a hero. He only needed them too afraid to run again. And indeed, history records that after a decimation, Roman troops entered the next battle with a cold kind of resolve. A resolve born not from patriotism, but from the fear breathing at their shoulder. If not cut down by the enemy, then by the friend in the next tent. Some modern historians compare decimation to an ancient style of management training. Today, we have workshops in team building, retreats, trust exercises, ropes courses. Rome had kill 1 in 10 as its method of binding men together. Both aim to build unity, but the modern retreat ends with photographs and a barbecue. The Roman retreat ended with a corpse and 9 men robbed of sleep for life. And as you see, Rome never hesitated to turn private pain into a tool of politics and war. If crucifixion was the public theatre for the people, then decimation was the internal theatre for the army. Both were bloody performances, only the audience differed. Even today, traces of it remain in language. We use decimate to mean destroy most of, but its root meant literally to kill 1 in 10. A sad trick of words, a concept that once made Roman soldiers shiver is now used lightly in economic reports or strategy games. But had you stood on those battlefields long ago, no one would have dared utter that word without dread. Perhaps the most frightening thing about decimation is not the number, it is the way it turned friendship into a weapon of punishment. No whips, no chains, just the compulsion of one man forced to kill another. Rome sowed a crack in the soul of every unit, a wound that never healed. And that wound, perversely, was the very thing that held the ranks tighter than ever. If crucifixion was a stage for the crowd, and decimation a stage for the army, there was another kind of performance reserved for Rome's elite, a solemn death complete with script and philosophy. And no one acted this drama more professionally than Seneca, Stoic philosopher, writer, statesman, and reluctant tutor to Emperor Nero. Yes, the very Nero infamous for using burning bodies as garden lamps. Seneca lived in a world where death was not merely the end of life. It was a final chance to declare one's views, to play the greatest and last role. For a Stoic philosopher, the ideal death was not a sudden one in sleep, but a conscious passing, slow, deliberate, ideally with a few aphorisms for posterity. Something like, "This is my final TED talk, but with the soundtrack of dripping water." In the year 65 AD, Seneca was accused of joining the Pisonian conspiracy to assassinate Nero. He denied it, but denial under Nero was as useful as arguing with a burning wall. The emperor sent him a polite message: "Take care of it yourself, or we will do it for you in a worse way." And so Seneca stepped into the starring role of his final play, Death in a Bath. It sounds elegant, but the reality was far from it. No roses scattered on the water, no fragrant candles glowing, only an old philosopher, a handful of loyal attendants, and a death sentence written in silence. Seneca chose to open his veins at the wrist. The blood flowed, mingling with the water. But his age and frailty slowed the stream. He tried at his ankles as well, then both at once. Still not enough. Some accounts even say he drank poison to be sure. Yes, the philosopher's serene death turned out clumsy, like anyone else's. Yet what mattered was not the slowness of dying, but how Seneca met it. Even as the blood drained, he spoke with his friends, gave final instructions to students, and turned his last gasps into a living lecture on Stoicism. Picture it, slipping into death, yet still managing to add, "Remember, life matters less than virtue." That was the kind of commitment only a Roman philosopher could sustain. They say Seneca treated death as if it were a philosophical case study. All his life he had written that one must be ready for death, seeing it as part of nature. And when it arrives, welcome it like an old guest, without screaming, without struggle. So when Nero sent his invitation to death, Seneca might as well have answered, "Oh, this guest, I've written thousands of pages about him. Do come in." There is, however, a touch of irony here. Seneca was immensely wealthy, villas, estates, a fortune vast, hardly the model of Stoic simplicity. People whispered he lived like a millionaire but wrote like a beggar, and his noble death, though impressive, could not erase that contradiction. But perhaps it made him more human. Philosophers too stumble. They too contradict themselves. They too die awkwardly. As Seneca finally let go in the reddened water, he was not only Nero's victim, he became a symbol of steadfastness, or at least of staying in character until the last breath. And Rome, which loved to make every moment a spectacle, must have nodded in approval. Yes, that death was worth watching. Perhaps what made Seneca distinct was not that he died, for all men die, but that he transformed it into a public lesson. If crucifixion showed the masses fear, if decimation showed soldiers consequence, then Seneca's death was a message to the intellectual class. Live so that in the final moment you can still make yourself the proof of what you believed. And that was the harshness and the strange beauty of Rome. Even in death, you must perform. The only difference lies in who your audience is and what words you choose before the curtain falls. Death, from a distance, looks like nothing more than a full stop. But for many civilizations, especially Rome, it was turned into a stage where a person could deliver a final statement about themselves. Across the examples we've walked through, crucifixion for the masses, decimation for the army, and Seneca's bath for the intellectuals, one thing keeps appearing. Death is not merely an ending, it is a message. The Romans might have fancied themselves the proprietors of turning death into performance art, but the idea surfaces elsewhere too. Think of Socrates in Athens. When convicted of corrupting the youth and impiety, he was offered escape. Friends arranged it, one nod, and he could vanish into the night. Socrates refused. He stayed, lifted the cup of poison slowly, and drank it like a late afternoon tea. They say he talked with his friends until his legs went numb and the chill crept through his body. His death was not a defense speech, it was proof. A philosopher who lives by principle must die by principle. Athens, which thought it had silenced him, unwittingly forged him into an immortal symbol of free thought. On the other side of the world, millennia later, Japan developed a related tradition, seppuku, the ritualized self-disembowelment. For the samurai, failure or shame could be worse than death. So they chose the most painful exit, as if to say, I still control my last moment. Unlike Roman crucifixion, where the condemned had no choice, seppuku was the ultimate elective, a form of self-determined fate. Here, death ceased to be punishment and became the final proof of honor. The contrast is striking. While Rome sought to turn death into a tool of control, both Socrates and the samurai used it to assert the self. Rome nailed slaves to crosses to remind everyone of state power. Socrates sat and drank to remind Athens and the world that thought cannot be chained. Samurai cut their bellies to remind enemies that honor cannot be taken. Standing between those examples is Seneca, a bridge of sorts. He was both a victim of Roman politics and a philosopher who tried to make death a moral lesson. Tacitus, the Roman historian, recorded Seneca's last moments in detail, stressing his conversations, his teachings, and the calm with which he faced death. For Tacitus, it was not merely an execution, it was a didactic performance, turning dry philosophy into a living image. Seneca's final letter to friends, where he reminds them that we do not lose time in living, we squander it, became a bold admonition, written just before the blood left his body. One could say human beings have used death as a language from very early on. This language needs neither script nor rhetoric. It needs only the way we choose to depart. And often, that is when a voice carries farthest. People may forget a speech, but they rarely forget a death staged with meaning. On the human level, there is a common thread. Everywhere, across cultures, death is used as a mirror of freedom. When everything else is stripped away, property, honor, friends, even truth, how we accept death remains the final choice. Rome may hammer nails, bind and coerce. Athens may hand down sentences. Japanese lords may force a samurai to kneel. But the individual decides, will I tremble or will I stand straight? That is why these deaths linger in memory. Not for their pain, pain is never in short supply, but for their human message. People can turn their last moment into a declaration. It is the last freedom, a place no empire can wholly reach. Looking back at crucifixion, decimation, or Seneca's death, we see more than Roman cruelty. We see a strange human creativity. Even in the blackest night, some find a way to make it light. Rome meant to sow fear, and yet it unintentionally planted symbols of liberty. Athens meant to silence Socrates and instead fanned the flame of Western philosophy. Japanese lords meant to uphold order and yet left behind the image of the samurai choosing death for honor, a cultural icon that endures. So if you're listening to these stories on a sleepy evening, remember, this is not merely about whips, spikes, or blades. It is about people pushed to the edge, who still manage to use death to say, I remain free. And perhaps in the quiet of sleep, that message reaches us more easily. A reminder that no empire, no power can entirely erase the final choice each person holds, the manner in which we leave the stage of our life. And so we have moved from deaths staged before the public to private departures wrapped in philosophy. But Rome did not stop at tormenting people in life or in death. They also left behind for posterity strange traces, tools, stones, prisons, that when archaeologists uncover them, they shiver and admit this was not just law, it was an art of punishment. So let us set aside Seneca's meditations for now and step into another realm where stone, bone, and metal tell the story. A world of cliffs that betrayed, of torture devices whose exact purpose no one is certain of crude carvings on the walls of Pompeii, and of arenas where the roar of beasts mixed with the cries of men. This is the next chapter of the journey. The archaeological mysteries and strange customs Rome left behind. There are Roman punishments whose very names carry both chill and spectacle. Crucifixion is infamous, decimation is dreaded by soldiers. But there was another place at the very heart of Rome, only steps from the bustling forum, that became a terror to traitors, the Tarpeian Rock. At first glance, it was nothing more than a cliff about 25 meters high, sloping from the southern side of the Capitoline Hill, a spot with a fine view over the city. A modern visitor might think, what a perfect place for a sunset photo. But to the Romans this was the edge for traitors, for men who defied the state, and for corrupt officials caught in their schemes. The sentence was simple: no executioner, no nails, no whips, just a march to the cliff's edge, and one push. Death from the Tarpeian Rock was stark and symbolic. No gore splattering, no drawn-out torment. Instead, a fall, swift, final, and steeped in shame. For Rome, to be cast from the Tarpeian Rock meant not only death, but banishment from the community itself. Picture it. A man who once wore the pure white toga in the Senate chamber, dragged through the streets, stripped of his dignity, and thrown from the cliff in front of the people. Rome's message was clear. You no longer belong to us. The rock's name came from an ancient tale of betrayal, sounding half myth, half drama. Tarpeia was the daughter of the commander of the Capitoline fortress. When the Sabines besieged the city, she was lured by their promises, specifically by the gold they wore upon their arms. She imagined glittering bracelets. But the Sabines had shields on their arms as well. And instead of jewelry, Tarpeia received the weight of those shields, crushing her to death. Her body was hurled from the cliff. From then on, the place bore her name, a reminder that betrayal never ends well. Executions at the Tarpeian Rock were often public. Crowds gathered, children giggled, adults muttered. There was little blood, but the sounds were unforgettable. The rush of wind past the ears, the heavy thud below, and then silence. They said it was the silence that haunted most. For when the body shattered at the hill's base, Rome erased not just a life, but a memory. The rock was not only for political traitors. Some records tell of liars in court, or rebellious slaves cast down as well. It was like Rome's version of the unfriend button, but harsher. Not only a block, but the deletion of account and person together. Archaeologists digging around the Capitoline have found broken stones, layers of reinforcement from different eras. No intact skeletons link directly to the rock, but ancient writers, Livy, Plutarch, affirm its use for executions, which means that every step you take on the Capitoline today may be on ground that once saw bodies hurled away for a single word: treason. The irony was sharp. Only a few paces from the Tarpeian Rock, stood the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, Rome's supreme god, guardian of the state. It meant that those condemned could see the splendid temple in their final moment before falling into nothingness. A one-way ticket from divine protection to erasure from mankind. Rome knew how to stage its dramas. Compared with other cultures, one sees a pattern. Punishments bound to place. In Sparta, a traitor might be beaten to death before the people. In China, there was lynching, the death by 1,000 cuts. In Rome, a cliff was enough. The landscape itself became symbol and participant in justice. For Rome, the Tarpeian rock was a reminder. No one is greater than the community, and no one can turn against the state without paying the price. Today, no one knows the exact ledge once used, but the memory lingers, a shadow in history. It reminds us that ancient justice was not only the sword or the axe. Sometimes it was only a push into empty air. And in that fall, the traitor vanished, not just from the earth, but from the common house called Rome. Among the relics left behind by Rome, some are instantly recognizable. A helmet, a coin, a shard of pottery. But then there are others, so strange that even experts are left scratching their heads. What on earth was this for? One of the most baffling is what we now call the Fork of Silence. The name sounds like something for twirling spaghetti, but the truth is, no one is certain. This object has been unearthed in Italy and in regions once under Roman rule. It looks deceptively simple. 2 long metal prongs joined to form a Y shape with sharp tips meant to rest against the throat. More precisely, it was positioned between the chin and the sternum, forcing the head to stay tilted upward. Some versions had cords or straps to fasten it to the chest or shoulders. At first glance, it resembles a crude medical brace. Yet fragments of ancient texts cast doubt on the healing device theory. So what was it for? 2 main ideas survive: a punishment device or a ritual object. 1. The punishment tool theory. Some scholars believe it was reserved for liars, chatterers, or offenders whose crimes were tied to their words. Instead of cutting out the tongue, too bloody, too brutal, Rome might have chosen something subtler, forcing the culprit to wear the fork of silence. It made lowering the head impossible, swallowing painful, and every attempt to speak brought the cold press of metal against the throat. Just imagining it feels suffocating. If crucifixion was a long, drawn-out symphony of suffering, then the fork was like minimalist music, spare, repetitive, but devastating to the spirit. Picture it, a person standing in the marketplace, neck forced upward, coughing as swallowing turned sharp. The crowd gathers, pointing, laughing. No blood spilled, but humiliation leaked out minute by minute. Rome loved punishments that doubled as public lessons, and this one delivered deterrence, entertainment, and cheapness, all in one. 2. The ritual object theory. Others argue it had nothing to do with punishment at all. Instead, it belonged to ritual. Some scattered writings describe witnesses or oath-takers required to lift their heads toward the heavens, proving that they spoke truth before the gods. If so, the fork was simply a device to hold the head aloft, a mechanical reminder. Remember, you are speaking under divine gaze. Lower your head, and you sin. Seen this way, it almost borders on comical. Imagine a Roman courtroom, a trembling witness, trying to testify while locked in an awkward upright pose, voice cracking, eyes fixed on the ceiling. The audience, meanwhile, unsure if they are watching justice unfold or a strange form of theatre. 3. Stray echoes. Medieval records mention similar contraptions used to discipline monks or believers accused of blasphemy. That continuity suggests the fork of silence may have survived long past Rome as a symbol, either be silent or be silenced. 4. An imagined experience. Slip into the victim's place. The fear lies not in sharp metal cutting skin, but in losing control over the smallest movements. You cannot bow your head to avoid a gaze. You cannot eat without difficulty. You cannot whisper. The fork turns every gesture into a reminder. You are being watched, and that sense of being reduced to a puppet of iron, your head forced skyward, is perhaps the truest punishment. 5. A touch of satire. From a modern angle, the fork of silence is almost like an ancient noise-cancelling headset, but instead of blocking sound, it blocks your own. Rome might have boasted, "We invented the real-life comment moderation system. Say the wrong thing and we'll silence you at the source." 6. The human meaning beneath, whether instrument of pain or of ritual, the fork of silence reveals something constant. Humanity's urge to control speech. From Rome to the Middle Ages, from courts to churches, words were always the most dangerous weapons. A sword can kill one man, a sentence can spark a rebellion. Perhaps that is why Rome forged this odd tool, to remind its people that silence is not always a choice, but at times an enforced law. Today, the fork of silence sits in museums, rusted and inert, drawing a mix of curiosity and unease. No one knows how it was truly used, yet in that ambiguity we hear a familiar message. Every society fears voices that step outside its bounds, and whenever that fear grows strong enough, people create instruments, from iron collars to digital algorithms, to keep others quiet. 2 small metal prongs, nothing more, but they open onto vast questions of power, fear, and the timeless need to bind human speech. While the Tarpeian rock required only a single push, and the fork of silence only 2 cold prongs of metal, there was a Roman punishment that was far costlier, far louder, and infinitely more spectacular. It was damnatio ad bestias, the condemnation to the beasts. If Crucifixion was an open-air stage, then damnatio ad bestias was the empire's full-scale blockbuster, complete with light, dust, music, and a supporting cast of lions, tigers, bears, leopards, even elephants. The principle was simple. The condemned, most often slaves, prisoners of war, or those deemed enemies of the community, were thrown into the arena where wild beasts were waiting. But Rome was never content with simple. They wanted myth come alive. Sometimes victims were not sent in empty-handed, but dressed in costumes, forced into roles of ancient stories. A young man made to look like Orpheus, only to be torn apart by bears instead of charming animals with a lyre. A woman transformed into Pasiphae, locked inside a wooden cow, then exposed before the crowd. What did it feel like, standing in that arena? Imagine being led through the narrow gate, the blinding sunlight striking your eyes, the stadium erupting, tens of thousands of throats roaring like thunder. Somewhere close, the low growl of a lion, the stench of animal waste mixed with human sweat. The ground beneath your feet, hot, stained with the dried blood of yesterday's performance. You tremble, yet you walk. Then the iron gate creaks open. The beasts surge forward. They need no script, no props, only instinct. And instinct tears. The crowd rises. They cheer, they shout, they laugh. Some turn away, others cry out to their gods, as though this carnage were an offering. And in that chaos, the condemned becomes more than a victim. They become myth. That was the strange horror of damnatio ad bestias. It was not simply killing, it was the art of death. Rome retold mythology with real blood, real flesh, no painted sets, no actors faking pain, real people, real endings. Under the sun of empire, legends were written in bodies. Perhaps the most terrifying sound was not the growl, but the audience. The amphitheater was never silent. It was a sea of noise, sandals pounding stone benches, vendors crying out watered wine, voices calling across aisles, and woven through the sharp edge of human screams. If crucifixion left you isolated in a crowd, damnatio ad bestias made you the centerpiece of a collective festival. Your death became the highlight of the afternoon. Historians like Suetonius and Cassius Dio recorded the spectacles in unnerving detail. Stone inscriptions still survive, advertising the line-up like theatre programs. 20 prisoners trampled by elephants today, a slave as Prometheus with his liver pecked by eagles tomorrow. Cold, efficient advertisements. Rome turned execution into entertainment and entertainment into industry. Beneath the arena, archaeologists have uncovered the underground chambers where victims waited. Imagine sitting there, hearing the roars echo through stone, knowing your own turn was minutes away. The fear was not only of dying, but of how you would die. For human beings fear not just death, but the manner of its arrival. And Rome perfected the craft of turning that fear into spectacle. In a way, damnatio ad bestias was a warped mirror of humanity's love of storytelling. The Greeks had tragedy, with actors, masks, and scripted endings. The Romans had living tragedy, with prisoners, beasts, and real blood. One left imaginary tears, the other stains in the sand. Both served the same purpose, to remind the community of limits not to be crossed, and of the gods, or the emperor, always watching. Today, in the Colosseum, all that remains are grey stones and bare earth. But if you listen, you can still summon echoes, roars, cries, the thunder of thousands. Damnatio ad bestias is gone. Its memory is not. It lingers, a question without answer. Why do humans turn another's pain into collective joy? And why, even now in this century, does that question remain unresolved? In Roman history, not everyone was executed by whip, by fire, or by beasts. There was another form of punishment, less spectacular, but far more enduring: branding. And in that world, a slave's forehead was a living billboard where carved letters became a moving sentence. If crucifixion turned the victim into a public spectacle for a day, branding made them a spectacle for life. Rome especially favored the letter F, short for fugitivus, the runaway. A slave who dared to flee but was recaptured would be punished with this brand. The letter F burned into the forehead with red-hot iron. From then on, every step he took down the street, the scar spoke for him. No questions needed. Picture the scene. A glowing iron lifted from the coals, the smell of burning metal mixing with the sharp stink of burning flesh. A hiss, a scream, then silence. On the forehead, the letter appears. First dark red, later a pale, twisted scar. A mark that never fades. It turned a human face into text. And that text had only one line: I betrayed, I was subdued. For Rome, this was not the shame of the master, but of the slave. They wanted to be certain he could never lift his head without seeing his own sentence reflected in another's eyes. You could change masters, change your name, but never the scar. It was the ancient version of a criminal record, written not on paper, but into skin. The evidence lives not only in books. In Pompeii, archaeologists uncovered graffiti, crude wall scribbles mocking fugitivi. Some even sketched faces with the branded F on their foreheads. The community turned the punishment into daily ridicule, a running joke on walls and in whispers. Branding did not end at the forge. It lingered in gossip, in memory, in stone. Beyond F, Rome branded other marks. Sometimes the slave carried his master's name, sometimes a letter for his crime. Later texts describe slaves branded latro, thief. Whatever the word, the meaning was the same. Identity erased. No person remained. only a forehead that speaks. Branding was not unique to Rome. Edo Japan cut marks into criminals' hands or faces. In slave-era America, hot irons sometimes burned ownership initials. In medieval Europe, thieves might wear a branded V or another letter. Ancient governments loved the practice for one reason. It was cheap, quick, and effective. No guards, no documents, just a scar that announced guilt with every glance. And yet, precisely because of this, it was one of the cruelest punishments. Crucifixion, for all its horror, ended. Branding did not. It lived with the victim until death, and sometimes beyond. Archaeologists have uncovered skulls scarred at the forehead, proof that even when flesh was gone, the mark of fugitivus remained. The true terror was not the iron's pain, but the permanence of being framed by society. A slave could serve obediently for life, but one failed escape condemned him forever. No redemption, no remission for good behavior. Rome could be generous in victory on the battlefield. With its slaves, it was not. Imagine a street in Pompeii. A branded slave walks by, head lowered. But even lowered, the mark is visible. And in the mocking laughter of passers-by, the message is clear. This community does not forgive those who challenge order. On a human level, branding reveals something deeper. People fear another's freedom more than anything. One runaway slave did not threaten Rome's armies. He did not topple the state. What he threatened was the idea that some were born to be owned. To crush that thought, Rome burned F into flesh, turning men into walking warnings. Today, in Pompeii's graffiti and in brittle texts, the obsession is still legible. Rome erased many things but chose instead to carve its fears into human skin. Those scars, though 2,000 years old, still speak. Rome ruled not only with the sword, but with the smallest of signs etched into the forehead. Across this wandering through Rome's punishments, we have seen the traces they left behind. The Tarpeian rock, where traitors were cast away, the strange forks of iron that forced silence, the arena where beasts became living props, and the seared letters burned into the flesh of slaves, each different in form, yet all bound by one logic: punishment not only to kill, but to inscribe. And the most unsettling truth is this: the inscriptions remain, not only in words, but in stone, in bone, and in the echoes of archaeology. In Pompeii, among crumbling walls, countless graffiti have been found, the scratched notes of ordinary citizens. Some mock the branded fugitivus, others carve the letter F on foreheads, so that even without the slave present, the scar was remembered, still on display. The walls themselves became extensions of the punishment, turning private pain into public laughter. Beneath the Colosseum, excavated chambers reveal a colder world: cages for animals, iron chains, wooden stakes, and the mechanisms that lifted bodies into sunlight. Not a backstage, but a prison. Victims sat there, trembling, listening to the roars above. Bones unearthed from these vaults bear cuts, fractures, healed scars. Proof that many had already been branded, shackled, beaten before they ever faced the sand. The remains speak for cries now buried. Step back further, and Rome no longer stands alone. In Edo, Japan, criminals were scarred or tattooed, carrying their sentence forever in flesh. In America, during slavery, people were branded with letters or marks of ownership. The pattern repeats across cultures: bodies became parchment, punishment became inscription. The message was simple: turn a person into a walking text so the crime can never be forgotten. The comparison chills us. Rome, Japan, America, 3 worlds apart, yet united in their obsession to make individuals into messages that move. A branded forehead in Pompeii, a seared shoulder in the American South, a scarred hand in Edo streets, all reduced to visible warnings. No words needed, just one glance and the community knew. Here lies the strange role of archaeology. It raises fragments, graffiti, bones, dungeons, and each fragment screams. We do not hear the voice of the branded slave, but we see the letter F scratched into Pompeian walls. We do not hear the cries of the condemned in the arena, but we see the grooves in stone, the cuts in bone, the channels where blood once flowed. It is, in its way, an archaeology of suffering. And the human thread? Perhaps it is this: scars, bones, clumsy letters on walls. All became witnesses in place of those forced into silence. They could not write memoirs, they left no diaries, but their bodies and their spaces wrote for them. A mark on a forehead, a letter on a wall, a broken bone in a pit, all whisper the same line: I was here, I suffered, I was silenced. Rome may have succeeded in turning punishment into deterrence, but it failed to erase memory. 2,000 years later, we still read, still translate, still piece together the story from fragments. And tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you might picture that scarred forehead, those eyes that never looked up again, and know that it is precisely the silenced who have given history another voice, the voice of pain that was never allowed to be spoken. Close your eyes. The roar of the crowd fades. What remains are the echoes of scars and bones, things without breath, yet more alive than any speech. That is the paradox. Rome wished to turn its victims into forgotten symbols. Instead, archaeology made them immortal. As we move past the traces of punishment, one truth becomes clear. The common people were turned into experiments. Their bodies became surfaces where power carved its letters, where the arena roared, where stone walls preserved ridicule. But for the elite, punishment carried another form. They were not branded, they were not thrown to the beasts. Their fear was different. To be erased from memory, stripped of the glory they believed would live forever in statues and epitaphs. Here we cross into another story. A story where punishments did not fall only on the lowest, but hung also above the heads of those seated at the highest tables. This is where power collides with memory, where legacy can shift from eternal monument to waking nightmare. Social and elite contrast power, memory, and legacy. While ordinary Romans feared the whip, the brand, or the beasts of the arena, the elite carried a different terror. It was not the sudden loss of life. Theirs often ended with ceremony, with ritual. What they feared most was erasure. To be stripped of memory, turned into one who had never existed. The Romans called it damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. A punishment colder, heavier than any blade. Imagine it. An emperor, a general, a senator, once greeted with applause, their names etched in stone, their statues rising across the city. And then for offending a successor or failing in a plot, they are condemned. Overnight, their inscriptions are chiseled out, their statues decapitated or their faces gouged away, their praises in the records crossed out. They do not die with a legacy. They are dragged into the death of forgetting. Reliefs still survive today, where two figures once stood side by side and but one face has been scraped away. Only the shoulders remain like a ghost. That is the essence of damnatio memoriae, not disappearance, but vacancy. The punished became a hollow space inside collective memory. And that emptiness was the insult. The most famous case was Geta, brother of Emperor Caracalla. They once ruled together. But after Geta was murdered, on Caracalla's order, the emperor wanted more than blood. He wanted silence. He commanded his brother's name to be erased everywhere. Faces scrubbed from paintings, heads severed from statues, names gouged out from stone. A slave could lose his head, a ruler could lose his memory. The irony, of course, is that these erasures made Geta immortal to us. Every faceless statue, every broken inscription whispers, "Someone once stood here." The cruelty of damnatio memoriae lay not only in the attack on one man, but on his entire household. His descendants lost their lineage. His wife lost her title. He disappeared from ancestral rites. In Rome, where honor and family tradition were sacred, to be cut away from memory was worse than death in the arena. And here lies the paradox. Slaves bore scars they could never hide. Elites lost even their names, their letters, their titles. One lived under a permanent mark, the other vanished into a permanent blank. Opposites, yet bound by the same logic. Power reshaped the human being into a warning. Archaeology proves the punishment was never complete. The gouges remain visible. The blanks themselves became records. Broken slabs, faceless statues, are evidence that someone was meant to be forgotten. But they are remembered precisely because of that. Pliny once wrote, "A man can be erased from stone, but not from whispers. And whispers, stronger than chisels, carry farther." Other cultures echo this practice. In Egypt, Queen Hatshepsut's name was hacked from her temples, so a later pharaoh might erase her power. In China, Qin Shi Huang burned books and buried scholars to command memory. In modern Europe, dictators edited photographs, cutting away those who fell from favor. Wherever power fears weakness, it reaches for memory. And yet the hollows it leaves behind become questions that will not rest. Each faceless statue in Rome, each defaced stele in Egypt, each altered photograph of the 20th century, all remind us of the attempt at controlled forgetting. And people, endlessly curious, always ask who was removed, why. The human truth is simple. We fear oblivion more than pain. We can bear the lash, the claw, the brand, but to vanish without trace, that is nightmare. And the great paradox is this: those who seemed safest, who thought themselves eternal in stone and inscription, were the most vulnerable to erasure. If branding turned the body into a sentence, then damnatio memoriae turned history into a courtroom. And sometimes erasure itself prolonged memory. Geta, Hatshepsut. All the names once forbidden, still whispered now. If in Rome the powerful trembled at the thought of being erased from memory, then on the distant frontiers, both in the ancient empire and thousands of years later in the American West, fear was simpler, rawer, the absence of law, and the reality that anyone could become the law. Here, justice did not always arrive through judges or courts. Sometimes it came from a crowd, a rope, and the right tree. In Rome, there was the Tarpeian rock. A traitor dragged to the cliff and hurled down, no lawyer, no evidence presented. Only the shared assumption, everyone knows he is guilty. One shove, a fall, the matter finished. The crowd muttered, pointed, then went home to supper. Not unlike the American frontier, where a suspected horse thief might be dragged into the square, tried by a citizens' committee, and strung up on the nearest oak. Rome and the Wild West shared this. When formal law was too distant, too slow, or too corrupted, the crowd filled the gap. But collective justice was rarely gentle. In Rome, executions at the cliff or public denunciations in the forum doubled as theatre. In the West, a public hanging drew the entire town. Gunmen, farmers, even children, all gathering as if for a fair. Picture it, a frontier town in the 1870s, dusk burning red across a dusty street. A man tied, accused of stealing a horse. Proof? Unclear. But the owner shouts, neighbors nod, and the crowd agrees. A chair, a rope, a round of applause. Justice complete. In Rome, the same rhythm, a condemned traitor hauled out, jeers rising, guards ready at the cliff, then the crash of a body against stone, and the crowd applauds, as if finishing a spectacle. Neither world was lawless. Both had codes, courts, officials, but the law felt far away, slow to move, or controlled by those in power. The ordinary people believed only swift hands could protect them, and swift hands rarely spared the innocent. A disliked neighbor, an outsider, someone who spoke too boldly, all could become victims. There is even a dark humor to it. Roman anecdotes tell of a politician accused of corruption. Before an inquiry could even begin, the mob stormed his house. By the time guards arrived, there was nothing left to investigate. In the West, records tell of an innocent man hanged because he shared a name with an outlaw. By the time the mistake was clear, the rope had already done its work. Collective justice had no room for correction. Yet it was not only cruelty. In strange ways, it was also survival. In a world without prisons or steady courts, citizens' committees and street trials kept communities from collapse. A real bandit punished swiftly might warn others away. In Rome, casting traitors from the cliff was a way of protecting the city from corrosion within. Looked at broadly, Rome was the Wild West of antiquity, a place where law was still taking shape and power belonged to those who acted quickest. And the American West was a miniature Rome, living with the same tension between official justice and the justice of the crowd. What unsettles us is the repetition. 2 millennia apart, half a world away, yet both societies responded to crime without courts in the same way. They built a stage, gathered an audience, and turned one person's suffering into a communal lesson. And so the human truth lingers. Justice, without a steady hand to weigh it, slips easily into the roar of the crowd. It can deter, but it can also crush the innocent. Rome saw it. The West saw it. And it leaves us wondering how many times in history the cries for justice were only a chorus drowning out the quieter voice, the voice of someone pleading, unheard, beneath the dust. If you stand in a Roman street where slaves are whipped to remind them they are nothing but property, you will hear the sharp crack of leather on skin. It is the sound of naked power, stripped of ornament. The lash does not only tear flesh, it tears dignity. It leaves echoes in the ears of the beaten and in those of the bystanders. And yet, only a few streets away, in the villa of a Roman elite, another sound rises, the plucked strings of the lyre, the gentle breath of the aulos or tibia. Music held as the sign of refinement, of culture. 2 worlds, one of lashes, one of strings, coexisted, separated only by a handful of steps. Rome, like every society, divided itself through sound. For slaves, the music was iron, whips, and the clinking of chains. For the upper classes, music was a display of power. Guests at a senator's home were greeted by lyres and flutes. Banquets at the imperial palace shimmered with performance, the same instrument of wood and string, but carrying a different weight, pain on one side, luxury on the other. And this contrast was not Rome's alone. In China, the crack of the whip echoed through prisons and barracks, tools of order and control. Yet in palaces, the chin sang, quiet, introspective, the voice of cultivation, of the gentleman's mind. In India, the veena, the instrument of Saraswati, rang as the emblem of wisdom and learning. Even while outside, sticks still fell on the backs of the powerless. There is a dark irony in how societies arrange their sounds. The whip and the instrument are both born of wood, of string, of the human hand, yet their meanings are inverted. The whip divides, the instrument connects. The whip bows the head, the instrument lifts it. The whip silences the lowest, the instrument gives more voice to the highest. In America's age of slavery, the lash was again an instrument of violence, while masters dined to the sound of violins. In Japan, criminals heard the sting of the whip, while nobles listened to koto and shamisen. Every civilization assigned its sounds, the lash for the low, the music for the high. The lesson is quiet but clear. Sound reflects power. Power lives not only in law or gold, but in the daily echoes that shape lives, and humanity is always choosing, whether to wield sound as threat or as comfort. A lyre cannot save anyone from the lash, but it proves that even as people learn to hurt each other, they also learn to soothe, to connect, to console. And in the end, it is not always the lash that lingers. The chin, the vena, the lyre, these remain in the soil of archaeology. The whip falls silent when flesh is gone, but the broken shape of a stringed instrument still tells us music once breathed through it. So, when you lie back and listen to history, imagine this. In the same ancient city, one person shudders beneath the lash, another reclines, sipping wine, listening to strings. Two worlds, never joined, yet echoing together. And it is in that opposition that we see most clearly how societies divide people with the crack of the whip and with the sound of music. When we step out of Rome and widen the view, it becomes startlingly clear. No civilization escaped its obsession with punishment. Rome had crucifixion, branding, damnatio memoriae. But turn eastward to ancient China, to the pre-Columbian Americas, or to the empires of the Middle East, and the same logic emerges again. Punishment was never only about the individual. It was about securing the collective. Each culture added its own local style, its own theater of fear. In China, cruelty was refined into craft. Few punishments became as infamous as lingqi, death by 1,000 cuts. The condemned was bound, and piece by piece, flesh was carved away. Arms, legs, chest, belly. Death stretched out for hours, sometimes days, and always in public. The crowd did not watch a man die. They watched a lesson written in blood. Betray the dynasty, defy the emperor, and you will be unmade. Dynasties rose and fell, laws shifted, but the image of a body dissolving into fragments lingered longer than any statute. Across the ocean, the Maya blended punishment with sacrifice. Captives and offenders alike could be offered to the gods. Blood spilled down temple steps was not just execution, it was fuel for the cosmos. Death was no mere penalty, it was an offering, a promise that the sun would rise and crops would grow. For them, punishment was sacred. It sustained order in the heavens as much as on earth. In the Middle East of the medieval age, punishment often cut to the point, quite literally. Theft might cost you your hand, a single stroke, both symbolic and practical. The hand that stole was the hand removed. No prisons, no guards. A blade was enough, and the stump became its own testimony, a portable sentence, seen wherever the person walked. Flesh became proclamation. China, the Maya, the Middle East, worlds apart, yet alike. Lingqi turned rebels into theater. Maya sacrifice turned criminals into ritual gifts. Amputation turned thieves into walking warnings. Different languages of pain, but one message: do not cross the line. Rome staged crucifixions and arenas. China drew agony out across hours. The Maya folded death into divinity. The Middle East branded crime with missing flesh. 4 methods, 4 cultures, yet all proved one truth. Punishment was never just a legal tool. It was a social one. And from that truth comes a human lesson. People fear chaos more than cruelty. Societies will accept blood, screams, even inhumanity, if it convinces them that order will hold. Rome kept its people with the arena. China with lynching, the Maya with sacrifice, the Middle East with severed hands. The common terror was not death, but disorder. There is a dark paradox here. The more powerful the civilization, the more elaborate its punishments. Greater power required greater spectacles: whips, chains, crosses, knives, pyramids, amputations, aimed less at the guilty than at the thousands of eyes watching. And when we look back from the safe distance of the 21st century, we realize something strange. These punishments, once instruments of fear, now stand as cultural signatures. We remember the Maya through their blood-stained steps, China through records of lynching, Rome through the cross, the Middle East through the image of the hand cut away. Punishment, distorted and grim, has become memory. Yet within this lies an unexpected optimism, for in remembering we learn. Punishment was made to instill terror, but time has turned it into a different lesson. That humans have always sought ways, brutal, creative, desperate, to hold order together. And in that memory, as bloody as it is, we see ourselves more clearly. A species not only skilled at destruction, but also at remembrance, at reflection, and slowly at change. When we circle back through humanity's punishments, from Rome to China, to the Maya, to the Middle East, a paradox emerges. The tools meant to divide, to terrify, to silence, have left behind the strongest bond of all: memory. Whips, arenas, slow executions, sacrifices, all designed to crush the individual and enforce obedience. Yet it is the memory of these scenes that connects us across centuries, stitching generation to generation. Think of the portrait of Caracalla and Geta, two brothers once carved together in stone. After Geta's murder, his face was chiseled out, a hollow where a man once was. Caracalla's intent was clear: erase his brother from history. Yet 2,000 years later, it is precisely that void, that scar of absence, that makes Geta unforgettable. The wound in the marble became an immortal memory. Rome wanted division. Memory gave connection. Or look to the wooden headstones of the American frontier. Rough inscriptions carved in haste, killed by vigilantes, shot as a horse thief, gone west, not forgotten. They were not art, only hurried scratches. Yet they reveal a society still raw, where law was uncertain. The dead may have been guilty, may have been innocent, but their names were marked, their presence recorded. Even in dust and grief, the memory of them became part of America's identity. Set side by side, the contrast deepens. Weapons, the whip, the blade, the rope, divide, ruler from ruled, insider from outcast. But memory defies that. It reconnects. A branded F on a Roman slave's forehead, a severed hand in the Middle East, a sacrificed body on a Maya steppe, a weathered grave in the Wild West. All these marks, brutal as they are, tell the same story, that even those humiliated left traces, and those traces return them to the human community. The human lesson lies not in the punishments themselves, but in the memories that survive them. People long not only to avoid pain, but to be remembered. A Roman slave feared not just the burn of the iron, but being erased. Geta lost not merely his throne, but his place in memory. A frontier prisoner did not fear the bullet as much as the chance his grave might be left unmarked. And so the message rises: punishment belongs to power, but memory belongs to humanity. Power sought to divide, memory keeps binding. By retelling these stories, we defy the will of the rulers. Rome wished its slaves silenced, but archaeology has made their voices echo. Caracalla wished Geta forgotten, but the broken statue preserves him. Vigilantes wished to erase a horse thief, but wooden markers held his name. Close your eyes. Imagine the crack of the whip in a Roman street, the plucked strings of a lyre in a villa, blood running down a Maya pyramid, a square silenced by lynchy. And now, millennia later, you can still hear it all, not in sound but in memory. That memory is the thread that ties you to them, not the lash, not the blade, but what survives beyond them. And so in the end, whips and weapons lived only for a moment. Memory endures. What people long for is not a painless life, for pain cannot be avoided, but to be remembered, acknowledged as part of the community, even if that community once turned its back. Memory becomes the only true reward, the quiet restoration of justice. Perhaps that is the deepest paradox of all. In this world, the one thing stronger than power is the memory of humankind. And so we have traveled from the suffocating silence of Vestal Virgins to the cruel theatre of Crucifixions, to the graffiti and scars that archaeology still whispers to us, and finally to the halls of power where even emperors feared being erased. If weapons divided people, it was memory that brought them back together. From the stone with Gator's missing face to the wooden grave markers of the American frontier, every trace reminds us that what humans truly long for is not just freedom from pain, but to be remembered as part of a community. Thank you for staying with me on this long, slow journey. If you found comfort in this story, please give it a like, subscribe to Historian Sleepy 365, and share it with someone who also loves a calm voice telling boring history for sleep. Until next time, may your dreams be gentle, your night be quiet, and may memory, not punishment, be what carries you into tomorrow.